Greetings to everyone. This is our study group, Spiritist Psychology, and I would like to hand it over to Leonel, who will be talking to us tonight. Over to you, Leonel.
Thank you. What I'm going to talk about today is Jung's idea that there is a God image within the psyche, an innate God image in the psyche. He calls it the God within. And he calls it the self as well. And we write the word self in the English language literature with a capital letter S because we mean the divine self. So we use a capital letter S to distinguish it from the personal self, like yourself or myself, which we write with a lowercase s. And what I think I'll do today is focus on the difference between Jung's ideas about this innate God image and how that compares to the God images of the major religious traditions. Because there are some very important differences. There's some overlap and some important differences. I also want to show that Jung's approach allows a kind of a personal connection to the divine within us that may have nothing to do with traditional stories about how the divine is itself. And the reason for that is because the way Jung talks about the self or the innate God image is that he shows that it can manifest itself, it can appear in a very wide range of ways, much wider than the God images of traditional religions like Christianity and Judaism and so on. And this is actually helpful for people who are not attracted to traditional God images. So I'm not sure if you've already talked about this already, but you'll remember perhaps that Jung believed that an experience is an experience of the holy or the sacred if it has certain qualities. He calls this quality numinous, and the numinous quality is mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, awesome, dreadful. So he's talking about experiences like Moses at the burning bush or Saul on the road to Damascus, hearing Jesus's voice saying, why do you persecute me, and so on. But the point that Jung makes is that experiences with this very numinous, powerful, awesome, dreadful quality are not confined to people in the Bible. They can occur to all of us in a dream, for example. It could be a waking vision, like those Moses and Saul. Those were waking experiences. Jung would say they are experiences of the divine self. Biblical examples, but you can have a personal example of an experience of the self which has that numinous, emotionally very powerful quality, but it's not particularly biblical or Judeo-Christian. So, for example, I had a dream in which a very large UFO, an unidentified flying object, came down from high above and hovered a short distance above my head. Now this thing was so huge that was pretty terrifying and awesome and dreadful. And then when I looked up, there were lights shining down on me. And when I looked up, I saw that the base of this UFO had eyes on it, and there was light coming down from these eyes shining down on me. Now, obviously, a UFO is not a biblical image of the divine. Although it's possible that something like the vision of Ezekiel, where he sees the God descending on a chariot, some people think that was a UFO experience. But by and large, most traditional theologians wouldn't see this as an experience of the sacred or the holy. But Jung would say it is, because it has this awesome numinous quality. It's so powerful and mysterious and fascinating. And another reason is that the UFO is mandala shaped. You remember, I'm not sure if you've covered this already, but But Jung thought that one of the major ways in which the self manifests itself in dreams and in traditional religious iconography is in the form of mandalas. These are highly symmetrical diagrams. They're used a lot in the Eastern traditions as meditation diagrams, and they're always some combination of squares and circles and crosses, stars, but they're highly symmetrical, like a huge UFO. And Jung thought that the mandala is a kind of abstract symbol because of the self, because the mandala demonstrates perfection and wholeness and completion and order and unity, and all those are qualities of divinity. So he thought that the mandala was an important self symbol. And when you have an experience like this gigantic UFO, you realize what Jung meant when he said that the ego, the individual personality, realizes that, in his words, he says, the ego is the object of a superordinate subject. In other words, the ego realizes that something is aware of the ego. Now, one of the major differences, apart from the type of experiences between Jung's approach and the traditional approaches, is that the traditional approaches would say that when the divine appears, it comes out of a heavenly realm, a transcendent realm. Jung thinks that these kinds of experiences arise within the very deep levels of the psyche, what he calls the collective unconscious or the objective psyche. So they arise deeply within our own subjectivity. They don't, what the traditions call heaven or the transcendent realm, for Jung is essentially somehow part of the deep level of the psyche itself. So this is actually a rather major difference, because Jung thinks that all the gods and the goddesses of all world religions and mythologies all arise from this deep level of the psyche. They are all archetypal figures that emerge from this deep level of the psyche. They don't live on Mount Olympus or in heaven or something like that. So Jung thinks that because we have this self, the God within, religion is inevitable. He says somewhere that if you were to get rid of all the world's religions tomorrow, the whole thing would just begin again, because this innate divinity in the individual is simply part of being human, and so it's going to manifest itself. And that's why the notion of God is really ubiquitous. You find it everywhere. We have this archetypal potential to experience a God image. And then what he thinks that what happens is that we grow up in a culture where there's always a local name for God. If you grow up in a Christian culture, you'll call it Christ. If you were in India, you'd call it something else, Shiva, or Vishnu, or some other name. But Jung thinks that whatever is the local name for God, that figure is able to carry the projection of the self. So people project the idea of the divine onto whatever they hear in the family, whatever the local name for God is. But again, the major point that I wanted to make is that the wide range of ways that the self can appear, which wouldn't be accepted as experiences of the sacred or the holy by traditional theologians. I'll give you another example that I heard not long ago. This is the dream of a woman who says in the dream she's surrounded by a kind of mist, and then she feels a presence in the dream, and then the mist opens and she sees a gigantic blue eye about 3 feet across. And I'll read her text. She says, I felt penetrated by its gaze, and I stood there in awe and fascination. And when you hear words like awe and fascination, you know we're talking about numinous experience. Okay? And then what happened is that the eye got closer, and then she could only see the iris, that central part of the eye, and the iris kept changing. At first it was circular, then square, then it changed from circular to square, backward and forwards. And then she said the eye was like a huge door or window, And beyond it, she could see this kind of special light that was infinite and boundless. She said, the light was unlike any light I've ever seen. I felt as though I was falling into it. So this dream was so powerful, it left her kind of awestruck. Now, again, the eye, Jung thought that anything which is circular or spherical, like an eye, is a self-symbol, because the circle or the sphere is a very ancient symbol of divinity in many traditions. So this is an archetypal symbol. The reason it's a symbol of divinity is that the circle or the sphere has no beginning and no end. And it's a perfect shape. And that's why it's always associated with divinity. And of course, the eye is another example of a mandala, one of the classical self-symbols. And then that interesting detail where the iris of the eye keeps changing from square to round, from square to round. That's important as well, because Jung thinks that images of squareness, like squares and cubes, are earthly symbols of stability and wholeness. They refer to the earth's 4 directions, 4 seasons, 4 elements, and so on and so on. So what you have is a symbol of the earth and a symbol of heaven, and they're alternating with each other. It's like, so this is an ancient motif. For example, you find it among the alchemists. I don't know if you've talked about alchemy yet, but this is the motif of squaring the circle, and it implies this mutual reciprocity of heaven and earth, or the union of heaven and earth in a higher synthesis. It's a very beautiful symbol, actually. And she felt that she'd been seen by the eye of God. And the awe and fascination that it inspired made me think that this was a numinous self-symbol, not necessarily particularly biblical, although there is, most traditions have the notion that we are seen by the eye of God and so on. So one could think about it that way. The question is whether this kind of imagery, which comes up in dreams very often, whether is it, as it were, generated by the deep psyche, by the collective unconscious, or perhaps there is a divinity beyond the psyche that transmits pictures of itself, images of itself, using the psyche as a kind of medium or vehicle so that human beings can experience it. In other words, we can't tell where these images are coming from. They might be coming from the deep psyche, they might be coming from a divinity beyond that. But Jung definitely thinks that the unconscious is the medium through which we have religious experiences of this kind. Jung thought that when you get an image like this, it's an image of something real. And he thought that, he said there's an original that the image is pointing to. We can't get past the image itself. We have to have some image in order to experience it. We can only experience divinity through the psyche. But this is why human beings, since the beginning of the human species, since our early hominin ancestors, have always had a sense of the sacred, because this capacity is built into our psychology. So let me give some more examples of the range of ways in which the self can appear, which you'll see are different than the biblical descriptions of the divine. Another one is from a letter reported by Jung, and the dream is that there's a star in the sky, and it's like a big, beautiful diamond with all the many facets, like a cut diamond, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And on the earth below is a small round pool, and this beautiful blue diamond star is reflected in the little pool below. And the dream says, heaven above, heaven below, or the ancient saying is, as above, so below. In other words, And the diamond, of course, is another self symbol. It's a perfect, valuable, highly symmetrical, eternal quality, and so that's the transpersonal aspect. And the pool on the earth obviously represents the individual psyche. So the dream is telling the dream. It's a teaching dream. It says that the divinity, as it were up there, it's not really up there, is reflected in the individual psyche. Now this kind of imagery with this quality is very common in the Bible. I mentioned the prophet Ezekiel. He had his extraordinary vision. It's so hard to imagine but the description in the Bible is that a cloud of light, and this is a waking vision that he had, with lightning flashes and figures with human forms, and each one of them had 4 wings and 4 faces, and each had, I think one face was a man, one a lion, one a bull, and one an eagle. And then there were wheels, and the rims of the wheels were full of eyes. And over that was a beautiful crystal globe, and then a throne above that with a figure that was surrounded by fire and radiance. And so he thought it was the glory of God, and so Ezekiel fell on his face, and so on. And this is traditionally understood as the descent of God in a chariot, because they didn't have any other way of imagining what this could have been, surrounded by angels, of course. And it became a source of inspiration in the Jewish mystical tradition. It's called chariot mysticism. Now, actually, a lot of commentators, when they read this description, they wonder whether Ezekiel may have seen a UFO because of all the wheels and so on. But of course, we don't know that. And there are also, I should say that when people have these experiences in a waking state, like Saul on the road to Damascus, or Moses at the burning bush, or this story of Ezekiel, people sometimes accuse these people of being psychotic. They say, oh, it was a hallucination. So that kind of thing, or they say, what were you smoking? Were you on drugs or something? Well, that is a very common accusation from psychologists who don't believe that there is a spiritual dimension, which is not uncommon among psychologists and scientists. They want to reduce the experience to nothing but something else. So, for example, Saul on the road to Damascus, hearing Jesus's voice, Saul was accused of being epileptic because there's a condition called temporal lobe epilepsy where people have kind of religious experiences and so on. So if you don't believe there is a spiritual dimension, you can find some other kind of non-spiritual explanation. But for Jung, and for people who agree with this approach, these are all experiences of the spiritual dimension, which for Jung is the objective psyche or the collective unconscious. They're the same thing. But the reason he quarreled with theologians is this very wide range of images, which a lot of people said that's not the way the divine manifests itself the way the Bible says, basically. And Jung is saying, well, no, because you can get all these other experiences with this very numinous, powerful emotional quality. So first of all, you recognize it because it's numinous. Secondly, you recognize it because it unites, the symbol unites opposites. So for example, if you had a dream of a figure that's both male and female, or both young and old, or for example, I heard not long ago a dream with a snake in it, and the snake had wings. Now that's what Jung means by the union of opposites, because the snake is an earth image, earth animal, and the wings, of course, suggest upward motion, spirit, and so on. So the snake with wings is the union of opposites. He thinks those kind of experiences are self symbols because the self, by definition, is the totality. It includes everything. It includes consciousness and the unconscious. Another way the self can manifest itself in a dream is sometimes the image is called the divine child. Sometimes you have a dream in which there's a child and there's something very special about the child. I had one recently where the eyes of the child were glowing in an extraordinary way, and it was the child was surrounded by a kind of golden glow. Well, when you get that in a dream, you know it's not an ordinary child. That's the divine child. The self is the divine child. You know, and plenty of religions have a divine child. There's the baby Jesus, baby Krishna, the baby Buddha, the baby Horus. I can't think of others, but it's a well-known archetypal image of a divinity which is young but going to grow. Anyway, you can get that kind of experience in a dream. And then you can also see the self manifesting itself as a natural phenomenon. For example, I've seen recently a dream of a huge mountain, and the mountain had this golden numinous aura or glow around it. It wasn't an ordinary mountain, and the mountain is obviously a symbol that links heaven and earth, you know, links spirit and earth. So that's the self as the natural world, or maybe symbolizing ascent to the spirit, something like that. Or even a huge tree. I've heard dreams in which a tree much larger than an ordinary tree will appear, with a special aura, glow around it. And that's the self manifesting itself as the cycles of nature, you know, growth, decay, regeneration, and so on. And of course, these are not traditional biblical manifestations necessarily. What about, another manifestation would be a powerful wind or storm in a dream. And now that is a biblical image. It's the ancient notion of the Spirit of God as a wind blowing over the waters. You remember at the beginning of Genesis, but it's a kind of impersonal presence of the divine. So that the theologians might not argue with, but they would argue with another way that Jung thinks the self can appear, which is of an outsized animal. I remember a dream in which a lion appears to the dreamer, and the lion is twice as big as a normal lion, and it again has that golden glow around it. So that's a self symbol. It's talking about the self at its instinctual animal level, but it wouldn't be accepted as an image of the sacred or the holy by traditional religionists, because it doesn't conform to biblical images. But Jung thinks that because of the numinous quality of the animal, that it is a manifestation of divinity, talking about divinity appearing at the instinctual level. Another way the self can appear is as a voice in a dream. Voice in a dream is not common, but it does occur. And always the voice has a very special quality. And you can get it as a feeling of an inner voice, or the inner, what the Quakers call the inner light, something inside you that you know is not you. And it's this inner light seems to know more than the conscious personality. It's like a spiritual intuition. You remember the still small voice that appeared to the prophet Elijah when he was hiding. I've already talked about mandala symbol, but I should tell you how Jung arrived at the notion of the mandala, the importance of the mandala. If you look at Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in 1927, he had a dream that he's in the city of Liverpool in the northwest of England. And in the dream, at the center of the city was a square, and at the center of the square was a circular island. So you got that squared circle image again. And there's a beautiful magnolia tree with beautiful reddish blossoms. And then the quarters of the city were arranged radially around this central point. You can visualize it as forming a mandala. And he said the central island was blazing with light, but around it, the city itself was dirty and sooty, and it was winter and raining and cold. So I think probably what was going on at that time is that Jung was having a difficult time, but he's given this dream to remind him that there is this radiant divine center. And he says in Memories, he says this dream was like an act of grace. And in fact, we do get this kind of mandala imagery when our lives are when we're going through a difficult time. You get these highly symmetrical kind of figures, like I see it in dreams, sometimes in the form of a very symmetrical garden or a temple, that kind of thing. And they do tend to occur when people are going through a difficult time, as if to remind you that the ego might feel it's having a hard time, but there is this very special center in the personality that you can rely on. See, Jung thought this kind of imagery, when you get it in a dream, is more reliable, more believable than a lot of anthropomorphic God images. You know what I mean by that is talking about God using human language. Like if you talk about God as a king or a heavenly father or shepherd, the Lord's my shepherd. Well, those are anthropomorphic imageries. That's human imagery. And that these are a function of the human constitution, you see. And this, a lot of atheists think that the ideas that we have about God are only the projection of human values and human nature. Whatever you like about human beings, you project onto your God image in a kind of exaggerated form. So instead, we're finite, God is immortal, God is infinite, we are fragile, God is powerful, and so on. So in other words, the atheists will say that we create a God image that reflects human characteristics without human limitations. And that's an old idea, but Freud picked up that idea, and he talked about God in this way. It's called the projective attitude, that you're projecting human qualities and characteristics onto your God image. And Freud thought that disproves the idea of God. It actually doesn't disprove the idea of God. It just says that you color your idea of God with human attributes. Usually what we do is we unconsciously color our image of God, the qualities we attribute to God are often qualities that had to do with our parents and our families of origin. If you had a very angry, punitive parent, you might project that onto your image of God and imagine that God is angry and punitive. And but if you had loving, benevolent parents, you might imagine that about God, or you'd come up with a God image that tries to compensate for very difficult parents. But this doesn't disprove the idea of God, which Freud thought. That's a mistake. It just shows that you're coloring your image of God with these kind of man-made projections. Now, Jung came up with this notion that a new God image is emerging in the Red Book. Okay. So in the Red Book, if you look page 244 of the Red Book, he says that a new consciousness, a new awareness of the divine is being born in the human soul against resistance. It's not easy to accept that a new God image might be appearing. And the resistance I can understand, because it's hard to give up the traditional God images. We're attached to them. You know, we went to Sunday school and church and so on, and we've been taught these images, like the God as a shepherd or a king or a father. We've been taught that stuff since childhood. But Jung thinks that we're on the cusp of a new, essentially a new myth of God, a new mythic image of God. And this is necessary because we have a different consciousness than, if you think about the founders of the traditions, people who wrote the Hebrew Bible beginning about, I don't know, 12, was about 1000 BC it began, something like that. And then in Christianity, the Christianity begins, say, with the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. Well, those people who began the traditions, they didn't know anything about depth psychology or cosmology or quantum mechanics. So I feel that given these kind of new developments that they didn't know about, we have to develop a God image which takes into account this new knowledge. And I think that Jung, the advent of depth psychology just over 100 years ago, really enables us to do that by taking into account this very wide range of God image. And it's not a new idea that God is born in the soul of the individual. You can find it in Meister Eckhart, a very important German mystic. So it's not a new idea. But Jung is really developing the idea, I think, very well. For example, he thinks that, well, obviously for Christians, Christ is the main symbolic representation of the self. But Jung points out that for us, the symbol of Christ is not a complete symbol of divinity for two reasons. One is that it's exclusively male, masculine, and he wants to include the feminine aspects of the divine. And two, he thinks that the Christ figure is very light and loving and benevolent. And he wants us to acknowledge that the divine has a dark side to it. I'll come back to that. But when he talks about the book of Job, he thought that that was an example of what he calls the dark side of God. So he felt that Christ was only a kind of a partial symbol of the self. Also, we have to, the other thing that was important to Jung is we have to stop thinking, Christianity tended to think, spirit in it. Jung thought that the alchemists realized that that's not true, that the alchemists realized that matter has soul and spirit in it. And he thought that when they talked about, I don't know if you've talked about alchemy yet in this course, but the alchemists talked about a figure called Mercurius, who represents the spirit in matter, or the light of nature, or the spirit in nature, the spirit of in the unconscious of matter, the spirit within matter, really. So Jung thought that you have the figure of Christ that's very light and loving and spiritualized, and then you have the figure of Mercurius as the spirit in matter. We have to recognize the spiritual dimensions of matter. Now, there are some other ways in which the self can manifest itself. I've talked about dreams. It can also manifest itself as outer visions. A vision is something that you see out there as if you're having a dream while you're awake. But another way it can manifest itself is through synchronistic events. I'm not sure if you've talked about synchronistic events yet, but this is Jung's word for when there's a correspondence in time between an event in the outer world, a physical event, and something in your mind, in your psychological state. So let's say you dream of a plane crash, and you wake up the next morning and there's been a plane crash. That's an example that von Franz gives. So obviously the dream didn't cause the plane crash didn't cause the dream, but you have a physical event and a psychological event. They don't cause each other, but they're linked because they have the same meaning. So that's what Jung means by synchronicity. So Jung thinks that this means that there's some deep level of reality. He calls it the unus mundus, or one world, where matter and spirit, or matter and psyche, are parts of a whole. And they only separate, we separate matter and spirit within the ego, but at that deep level, they're not separate. And so synchronistic events somehow emerge out of that deep level of reality, and they have this meant to be quality. Well, he thinks that it's the self that arranges that kind of thing. Oh, actually, what might be interesting in this context is an idea of von Franz, where she talks about what she calls the social function of the self, which would be relevant to a group like this group today. She says that that we gather around ourselves a kind of a soul family. We gather around, or we're brought together synchronistically. A group of people get together, not by accident, because of this deep spiritual interest. She calls it reciprocal individuation. And she thinks that these kind of relationships have meaning, and we are brought together with the people that we belong with by the self. So that's another way in which the self can manifest itself, in the form of important synchronistic events. Let's see. So I think I may have been talking. I don't know if I should stop, and what do you think?
I think you could.
Shall I stop talking, or shall I carry on? I don't want to encroach on it.
I don't know, Lionel. I will be talking. Joanna side. She refers to the Bhagavad Gita, you know, the Hindu text, and Arjuna and Krishna, the myth, you know. And I will talk. I will show some images and talk a little bit, because she refers to this episode. So would you like me to, because that it's an example of the self and self.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. That's very interesting, because the Gita says it's the same self in all of us, and Jung also says it's the same has to be, of course, the same in all of us. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah. So
maybe I will show the PowerPoint now, and then Lionel comes back, I think, to comment, right?
Oh, okay.
And also about what Joanna says, Lionel. Is that okay?
No, well, let's see. Maybe there'll be some conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, carry
on. So let's see. I'll just share the screen. Oh, Fabrizio, you have to, I'm disabled here.
Okay, 1 second. Yeah, go ahead, Anahy.
Just tell me if it's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, just a second. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so these are contributions by Joanna de Angelis about the self that we are talking today. So in the book Personal Triumph, chapter 5, that she calls Confrontations, Joanna de Angelis makes a reference to the Bhagavad Gita, okay, that we know has been written around 400 BC. I have some problem here because it's very, for me to read. Let me just say. I want to, just a second. Okay. So the Bhagavad Gita, also known as the Song of the Lord, the Sublime Song, or the Message of the Master, is the essence of Indian Vedic knowledge and one of the greatest classics of spiritual and philosophical literature in the world. Just some, okay. In its literal sense, as the best known part of the Mahabharata, the greatest work of Sanskrit literature and one of the most important of universal literature, it contains the advice of Krishna, the supreme personification of divinity, To Arjuna, his confidant, friend, and devotee, trying to free him from the restlessness and perplexity in which he found himself on the verge of a fight against his own relatives. But in addition to this historical, material, and literal sense, the Bhagavad Gita, like all sacred scriptures, has various degrees of spiritual meaning. Arjuna's perplexity figuring the struggle that takes place within every human being between God and evil, between the superior forces of the soul and its inferior forces, inferior forces. So Krishna, who explains to him the true human nature and his relationship with God, is the word of God, the Logos, or the Christ in us, our immortal divine consciousness. So I would like Lionel to comment afterwards. According to Joanna, in the book Personal Triumph, Krishna warns the disciple Arjuna about the need to fight vices, those terrible adversaries that live in the depths of the soul and drive to crime and madness. Relatives of the virtues, they must be faced with courage and moral strength in a continuous battle in the field of consciousness. The Pandava prince, Arjuna, however, is reluctant to destroy these family members who in some way constitute his clan and are part of his life. However, the Guru explains to him that his maturity, his adult age demands this sacrifice, no matter how rude it appears to him. The young man has no alternative but to fight, to face the moral imperfections that stain his character and darken his feelings. These legacies that come from the primary instincts that evolved and reappear as lust, excessive ambition, voluptuousness, hatred, resentment, possession, desire, all generators of deep internal conflicts that explode in alienating behaviors. So according to Joanna, it is a valuable undertaking to detect enemies and external challenges. However, this somewhat distorted view of reality only results from the transference of inner conflicts which the being refuses to face, thus making his task a more difficult one, if not impossible, to carry on with the desired success. So when Lionel talked about the dark side of the self, I think it would be nice to comment a little further. Mm-hmm. So self-awareness constitutes, for Joanna, an advanced step in the field of emotional and psychic health, working in favor of organic health. Every time someone runs away from a psychological confrontation, she will find it ahead in a more challenging and rooted in the self way, waiting for a balanced solution. Personalities who have become accustomed to the status quo are reluctant and maintain existence in the old patterns, avoiding taking on the new reality. Also about this, we could comment a little further, Lana, about the new God image, okay, in this context. Thus, they lose the clarity that comes from self-growth, from victory over afflicting passions. Confrontations in this way are fields of struggle in which the being grows and develops the invaluable resources dormant in the self, according to Joanna, which are waiting to offer the contribution of peace of the nirvana. In the book Encounter with Peace and Health, She says that our spiritual destiny is the numinous state. Okay. Every commitment must be undertaken so that the process of moral and spiritual self-improvement takes place without setbacks or fear in the face of our progress and achievements. Reminiscent of ancestral inheritances, our ascension march is made of victories of the self over the dense shadow, for Joanna, which makes discernment difficult for the self, the shadow aspect, or binds it to unhealthy habits that must be overcome. The search for enlightenment, that is, the conquest of self-transcendence, is an imperative of evolution. This is Joanna saying. And then in Personal Triumph, she says, if we consider the self as the immortal spirit, Jung never said that, right, Leona? But Joanna is asking us to consider the self as the immortal spirit, which precedes conception and survives carnal dissolution, then the ancestral experiences resulting for all reincarnations throughout the evolutionary process to which it is submitted will be archived in the depths of our souls, of our spirit. This archetype, original image or imago Dei, that lives in the human being and grants us the scope of consciousness and unconsciousness, accounting for our totality, as Lionel said. For Joanna proceeds from the primordial archetype, cosmic consciousness, God, or absolute causality. Okay. All activity, conscious or not, of the human being must be directed towards the identification of the self, capital S, integrating the remaining psychic contents of past memories. And when she says past memories, other past reincarnations, with the ego, and favoring the search for this primordial archetype in order to achieve harmonization of a cosmic nature, which must be the fatality of the evolutionary process. And then she refers to Allan Kardec in the Spirit's book, that when he was concerned with the final stage of the evolutionary process in some questions. And with a deep psychological vision, he asked the spiritual messengers that were being channeled in the process of writing the Spirit's book. And then he asks, what does the spirit become after its last reincarnation, when the spirit doesn't have to reincarnate anymore? And the spirits answer, they replied, blessed, poor spirits. Okay, that's the destiny. So I made this quick PowerPoint so we could see what Lionel would comment and what the questions would be. Okay, that's about it. It's a lot of things that Joanna tells us about the, I'll just stop sharing, about the self, and we will be talking more about that. But I wanted to, so that we have Lionel here, that we could see your thoughts about that, Lionel.
Yeah, well, it's very consistent with what Jung says. I mean, he would agree that the self is spirit, and that it's eternal and so on. He says all that kind of thing. Well, maybe I should talk about the notion of the dark side of the self that you mentioned, because this is very controversial. It in some ways contradicts traditional Christianity. What happened was that Jung read the biblical story of the book of Job, you remember that the story of Job is about an apparently innocent, pious man who suffers terribly for no obvious reason. So this is an archetypal image of the suffering of the innocent. Why it's an eternal theme. Why do innocent people suffer? It's going on now in Ukraine, of course. And the story, I'll just summarize the story. The story begins with a wager or a bet between God and a member of the heavenly court, or one of the sons of God, and this Satan figure says that Job is only good and pious because he's very wealthy. God has given him so much. So to test this, whether he would be good and pious without all his possessions, God allows Job to suffer terrible losses. He has 10 children, they're all killed when the roof of his house collapses in a storm, and all his sheep and cattle and goats, everything that he owns is stolen. So he's reduced to nothing. So Jung thinks that this is an example of an innocent person experiencing the dark side of God, or the dark side of the self. He wants to make the point that we can't have a naive image of God that says that God is only loving and good, that God also causes these kinds of terrible things to happen. And Jung's point was that it was as if in the story that God didn't realize the way he was making Job suffer, because God was unconscious of this dark side of his own nature, which is manifested by this cruel treatment of Job. But Jung says we have to have a God image that has positive and negative qualities. So it's going to have a mixture of cruelty and mercy and kindness and anger and love and so on, and destructiveness, all existing side by side. And this became extremely a very controversial idea, because in traditional Christianity, they preferred to think of God as only good and loving. And anything evil, for example, they would project onto the devil or the Antichrist. So a lot of Christian theologians couldn't accept that. Remember, the first letter of John says, he is only light and in him there is no darkness. So a lot of Christian theologians couldn't go along with Jung on this point and acknowledge the dark side of the self, the dark side of the God image. But Jung thinks that's an act of denial. What happens in the story is that Job tries to remain faithful to God, but it seems as if God is projecting his own lack of faithfulness onto Job. In other words, it's God that's unfaithful in the story. It's really a very important story. And Jung thought that Job manages to maintain his integrity and insists on his innocence. And this forces God to become conscious of his own dark side, which he hadn't realized before. Okay. Anyway, and that's another controversial aspect, whether God could be unconscious of some aspect of his own personality. A lot of people objected to that. So Jung thought that when you look at, say, if you look at huge events like what's going on in Ukraine right now, or big events like the recent earthquake in Syria and Turkey, or the Holocaust, those kind of things, the fact that God allows this terrible level of suffering to occur means that you can no longer think about God as only good, the ultimate good. You have to acknowledge that some of this evil and destruction and suffering is the result at least of divine permission for this to happen. Everything that exists, including evil, is a function of the Creator. And if you think that only human beings are responsible for evil and suffering, then you make human beings scapegoats for all evil. And that doesn't do justice to the enormity of suffering and evil. So that became a big bone of contention between Jung and many theologians. And there are a few theologians who acknowledge the fact that God can sometimes behave in a way that seems very cruel and destructive. You see a lot of that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. You see it a little bit in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, where you have these avenging angels casting people into pits of fire and so on. But you see a lot of it in the Hebrew Bible, where God is a warrior God, and a God of destruction and violence and so on.
Lionel, I just wanted to comment something. In the beginning of so that makes a little clear for people listening to us.
Okay.
As you yourself said in the beginning of your talk, the God image, okay, that it's synonymous of the self. We are using here as a synonymous of the self. We don't know if it is a connection or the divinity within manifesting through the psyche, right? Or if it's receiving energy or information of a transcendent being beyond this dimension, even beyond the collective unconscious. Remember, I showed a little bit of your graphic from your book, Spirituality Beyond Religion, for everybody in the class, Archetypes and Complexes, okay? So we are here on the verge, as you yourself said, of a new myth of God. Mm-hmm. Because we are evolving, we have quantum physics, and we have other informations, our better understanding of, we have depth psychology. So even in answer to Job, Jung says, like, it's a preparation in a certain way. It's a new myth of God being born, because that God that is also like have moments of lack of faith, let's say, in itself, right? Or can be angry, can be persuaded to do bad things to Job. But because of all that conflict, it incarnates, let's say, in the image of the Christ, right? Because then it comes the second part, the loving God, that Jesus represents, the gospel and all this, the second part, let's say, of the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. So we could say that's a thought, and I want to share with you, because in the Spiritist knowledge, as Allan Kardec and the Spirits told Allan Kardec, Spiritist is dealing with religion in the sense of religiosity, the reconnection with our inner aspects, with philosophy and science. That's why we say that it's a knowledge that is coming from the spiritual realms, to try to help us in the new myth of God, let's say, in expanding these primordial archetypes, our understanding. So I think for me, it's what Joanna and the Spiritist knowledge are trying to help us to realize that we are again in a new myth, in this, as Edinger, right, said, the new God image. So that is, we are going further in the understanding. So for me, with everything that I have read about in Joanna's and also Chico Xavier and his mentors, all this imagery that we can see in the numinous experiences, the paranormal experiences, mediumistic experiences, so they are helping us for for what Joanna is saying, this another jump in the evolutionary process, another expansion of consciousnness.
Yeah.
So what happened is that what I agree with you, and I tend to think that I loved your, when you refer to the head office, right, to that part that we don't know where it is, and it's probably beyond what we can understand, even the depths of our unconscious, this transpersonal dimension. And just to give I don't want to go further, but I was listening to some guy that it's a Japanese scientist in the US that is very popular. I can't remember the name, but this new telescope, Webb, I don't know if I remember it. Yeah. I don't know if you guys saw that it photographed like 6 whole new constellations or galaxies, right, Sylvia? They changed all our understanding of the making of the galaxies because of the age, because they are very ancient in a certain way, very full of mass and stars and galaxies. But they are also very, very old in the Big Bang, whatever. So for our understanding, it wouldn't be, our scientific understanding, it wouldn't be possible. So because of all this discovery, and also another, I want to share with you, I have listened to a lot of channelings lately about all this darkness in the world, the war that you said and all this, and it's provocative in a certain way. It's coming from spiritual realms. It's not that the darkness it's increasing. It's because the light is increasing that we can see the darkness that was already there, like the shadow concept. Okay. And I think this is great because it's like, you are doing, you're cleaning your house and you move the furniture, and then the cockroaches, the bugs, the whatever, start appearing. So in the answer to Job, I think it was one moment where one of the moments in our evolutionary process that we had this jump in changing our God image. For one that was dark, because could punish you, could, steal things from you, you could die and all of this, to one of loving. But I agree with you, is this the ultimate reality? Because why God would allow, the darkness to exist if God is all light, even in the universe that we understand, that we know, because we know in the spiritual dimensions, because of the spirits, it's not exactly like this, but in our material universe that we can see, we have light and darkness. We have the darkness of the space, and we have the stars, the constellations, the galaxies, and all that. So I think we are on the verge of expanding again our consciousness and all this transformation of this God image that it's so awesome in a certain way, so tremendous and fascinating. And they make I want to look at the Christ the way I have in my heart and in my memory, like you said, but we have the culture because, and then we say, well, but it's not like this anymore because I can see Christ in a synchronicity. I can feel, not see, feel in a synchronistic event, right? So I just want to share this idea that this dark side, so that people won't, when we are talking about this dark side, and even the dark side of the self, the God image, just to make sure that we don't know, we are not talking about ultimate, the divine consciousness, the cosmic consciousness, because we don't even know where it is, the head office, right? So we are talking always when Lana is talking, I understand that it is the God image, is the God within. So of course it will have shadow and darkness because we are still in this level, but we cannot say that about the ultimate reality and cosmic consciousness. I don't know if you want to comment on that. It's my thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about what Edinger called the new dispensation, which is his idea. The word there means a new way in which divine grace is dispensed into the world or emerges into the world. And he thought that the first dispensation was the Mount Sinai, with the law handed down, carved in stone. The second was the appearance of Jesus Christ with a radical change in the God image, as you say, into a God of love. And he thought the new dispensation is this notion that by paying attention to the psyche, that we can have a direct experience using the psyche as a medium. That was Edinger's, which I think is correct, although it is controversial. A lot of people don't like the idea because they don't like psychology being turned into a spiritual discipline. They want it to be a secular pursuit. But, I don't mind doing that. So, okay, so, but you're right also that we have these God images in the psyche. We don't know exactly whether that tells us anything about the divine beyond the psyche. We can't tell that. But for me and for a lot of the Jungian community, these self-images are manifestations of divinity. And sometimes they have a very negative quality to them. So, the Jung thinks it's naive to think it can only appear in a helpful, loving way. That's only half the story. So your shadow, the human shadow material, meaning the negative aspects of the personality, parts of yourself that, that you wish were not like that. That is the incarnation, a fragment of that is the incarnation of the archetypal shadow. So there's a little bit of archetypal shadow within the individual personality. The shadow is not entirely personal. It's kind of a radical idea. And I mention it partly because a lot of Christians object to this idea. They say, I only experience a loving God. I don't like the idea that God could have a dark side that causes suffering and evil. So this has been a long-standing argument.
Yeah, we say that this is also, it has been a practical course also, because a lot of synchronicities like the dragonfly happen. And about what you said, well, I'm sorry, I'll send you the dragonfly PowerPoint so you can see. Okay. And after the meeting in the first meeting that we had in Italy, some of the people here have been there, but it was right, Fabrizio, kind of prepared quickly, let's say. But after a season, I went to Sicily. Okay. I wanted very much to, you talked about the mountain and the self. I had this urge to climb Mount Etna, the volcano. I don't know why, don't ask me. Maybe I was
with you.
Next time I'll take you there.
No.
So what happens? I was, I think I know I had a numinous experience because it was, okay, you can say there was an organic thing because of lack of oxygen, right? Because it's so high. But people, I want to show you something. All the mountain, all the craters, I think you say in English, it's everything dark, okay, because of course, the lava, and when I went quickly, okay, because a lot of people like me like to see also when you go there, buy some water in a small shop or whatever. The first image that appeared to me, only 1 second. The first image that appeared to me, that it's made with the lava of the volcano. Look here, see if you can.
Wow. Wow, that's beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's also a synchrony. I was very, very moved and touched because I went up and down the volcano, and it was all dark. I don't like, black stones and things like that. And I was filled with that darkness of the mountain, but it's a dark mountain. It's a mountain, but it's a dark mountain. And when I go, I was kind of, feeling the impact. When I go, just to buy some water, this image was there waiting for me because it was the only one.
Is it like is it a black Madonna?
Yeah, look.
Black Madonna, yeah. It's the dark feminine, the dark goddess.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
She has a dark side, I'm afraid.
I know you always like.
No, it's true. It's true. Think of
I know, but you see how brilliant it is.
Oh, yeah. No, I think it's wonderful. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, Lana, it was the of course, the feminine and the mother has also a dark side, but in the context, the synchronicity was well, we say a lot in the Spiritist knowledge. And you said about the alchemy, to illuminate the matter. When we say the kingdom of heaven, it's inside of us. And our evolutionary process, like a spiritual process of evolution, our expansion of consciousness, is to live in the matter so that the spirit can illuminate the matter. Of course, the matter will bring a dark side to the spirit. Because living here in the matter and suffering the instincts and all the passions of that the matter brings to us, we will get in contact with this dark side. And it's part of the process, the evolutionary process. But it's not that we should be taken by the dark side. It's the opposite. It's to illuminate the dark side. It's one of the way of thinking about. But I don't know if you want to comment, because I know that Sylvia and also Bianca, they are with the hands up. But would you like to comment first, Lionel?
Well, I think we should have some conversation. But the problem is, if you are suffering and experiencing evil, something like if you're in Ukraine or something, and you think this is the experience of the dark side of the self, what could be your attitude to it? How do you address it or contain it? That's the problem that we have.
Well, before the hands, I want to answer. Okay, not answer, but comment in your question with something that happened right after I've been here for a couple of days only in Brazil, still adjusting to the 5 hours of difference. But when I arrived, there was an awful killing of small children in a state, in a city, in a state near, the south of Brazil, near where I live. And I heard from an old lady, because everybody's very angry at it. Something like it happens a lot in the United States and other parts of the world. We can say that the guy went crazy. It's a person in his early 20s, connected to the internet with all the images, bad images, playing games, crazy games of killing people. And he went there in very small children, 3 to 2, 4 years old, and killed a lot of them. some of them, well, but the thing is that I heard from a lady that has been practicing her spiritual development for many, many years, that when she goes home, she has to go through a very bad part of the city. And that she has always been doing that. When she gets in the car, like cognitive behavioral, when she gets in the car, she starts praying and sending light to the killers, to the crazy ones, to the, and she increased this amount, not only praying for the children, for the parents, but also for the killer, okay, for the murder. And I thought, when she was telling me this, her energy, we can feel the energy of the person. If she was, she changed her face when she was just telling this. So I think one of the things, the integration of good and evil, like we know that we have to integrate the shadow in order to work with it, to make us whole, what the shadow aspect. But it's very easy for us to get mad at people that do something really bad, right? And to immediately feel bad energies against the person. Instead of thinking, we have all the knowledge of the gospel, for instance, of the Christ saying that we have to forgive. Now, how many times we have to forgive, and to love the enemy. But it's so difficult for us, 2,000 years of his teachings, and we cannot integrate what it means to really join the parts, right? Really understand, to overcome what it's evil in us. So I think this praying for the killer is something that we don't, and for the crazy people that are fighting or that are doing bad things, I think it's something still very difficult for us. So thank you so much, Leonel, and we will be anxious to hear you again about synchronicities and numinous experience when you are able. Okay.
Well, do you want me to come back in 2 weeks or not?
For us, anytime that you are available, Mark said that, anytime you are available.
Well, what's I can come in 2 weeks on May the 14th. What is the topic?
Great, because I talked to them about the archetypes and the complexes, right?
Oh, okay.
And I was going to talk about the persona in the shadow. So since we talked about the dark side, maybe, and as you said and Jung said, that in the core of the complexes are the archetypal, the archetype, and our personal myth, what manifests in us. So I think if we are in the subject, I don't know what people think, but if you talked about the dark side of the self, so maybe we should go and like in your graphic of the waves, and go and take a look in the shadow concept. Okay. And how the shadow, our personal shadow, how the shadow manifests and connects with the collective shadow. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay, we'll talk about the shadow. You want to do that, or you want me to?
No, you start. I think we can do and I bring what Joanna says. My role here is, and then we can have all this conversation. I think it's interesting, right, people? I don't know what. Yeah. Could it be like that? Yeah. Okay, so next episode, right, will be about the shadow.
The shadow. Okay. Not an easy topic, but okay.
Cool. Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, Anahy. I know there are some more people that want to make some questions. So what I will suggest, if you write the question to me, I will share with the group, and then when Lionel or Anahy has got some time, they will get back to us with the answers. Would that be okay? Mm-hmm.
Or we can answer also in the next meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just very